I still remember the moment I felt it in my bones that something was terribly wrong. For 2 weeks, my son Daniel hadn't picked up a single call. At first, I told myself he was busy, maybe working late nights, maybe caught up with his own life. But a mother knows the difference between busyness and silence. This wasn't ordinary silence. This was the kind that presses on your chest like a weight you can't push off. One gray evening, I packed a small bag and boarded the late bus to his town. The rain streaked across the windows as the bus hummed along the highway. I sat still, watching the blur of streetlights and feeling my stomach twist tighter with every mile. I tried to steady my breath, but deep down I knew something had snapped in the rhythm of our family. When I finally stepped off, the cold air bit through my coat. Daniel's townhouse stood at the end of the street, its windows dark against the storm. I climbed the familiar steps, my heart knocking against my ribs. I knocked, called his name, waited. Nothing. I pressed my hand to the doorknob and felt my breath hitch when it turned easily under my palm. Daniel never left the door unlocked, not with little Liam inside. The living room was chaos. The sofa shoved sideways, shards of a broken mug glittering on the carpet, and dark stains spreading in patches that made my chest tighten. My voice cracked as I whispered for my grandson, but only silence answered. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hands brushing the railing for balance. Each room was empty, eerily still. Until I reached Liam's bedroom, I froze. A faint scraping sound crawled out from under the bed. My knees wanted to buckle, but I forced myself closer. My voice trembled as I whispered his name, though I wasn't sure he could hear me. And then I saw him, curled into himself, thin as a shadow, clutching an empty plastic bottle in his small hands as if it were the last anchor keeping him alive. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring past me into a place I couldn't reach. For a moment, the world stopped. The storm outside, my pounding heart, even my breath, it all disappeared. Only Liam remained, hidden under that bed. And I knew this was just the beginning of something far darker than I was ready to face. The sirens screamed through the night as I sat wedged in the back of the ambulance, clutching Liam's hand while the paramedics worked over him. His little body was limp against the stretcher, his skin cold and clammy, his eyes staring into some place far away from me. I fanned his face with a folded scrap of paper I found in my coat pocket, whispering over and over that I was here, that he was safe, though I wasn't sure he could hear me. My words felt like prayers thrown into the dark. When the doors burst open at the emergency entrance, a team of doctors and nurses swept him inside. Their voices were brisk, clipped, purposeful. Words like dehydration and severe malnutrition cut the air, sharp as knives. I stood frozen in the hallway, my coat still clinging to me, afraid to breathe too loud, afraid to get in their way. The sight of that IV piercing his fragile arm nearly split me open. My grandson, the boy who once couldn't sit still long enough to finish a bedtime story, now lay silent, barely clinging to this world. As I pressed my back against the wall, my mind pulled me back to better days. I remembered how Daniel used to call me every Sunday evening, even if it was only to say he was tired, but everything was fine. He always slipped in a detail about Liam, how he was learning to ride his bike, or how he laughed so hard at a cartoon that milk came out of his nose. Those calls were my lifeline, reminders that no matter how quiet my house felt, I was still stitched to theirs. The silence of these past weeks now felt like a scream I had ignored. Hours blurred under the harsh fluorescent lights. Nurses moved in and out, adjusting machines, checking charts. I finally allowed myself to sit by his bed, stroking his hand, humming the lullaby I once sang to Daniel when he was small. I prayed that somewhere in that quiet, Liam would remember he was loved. His fingers twitched against mine, not enough to reassure me, but enough to keep me anchored. Then came the knock on the doorframe. A detective stepped in, his face drawn, his voice heavy. He told me they had gone back to Daniel's townhouse and used special chemicals to search for hidden evidence. Under the glow of luminol, the living room lit up with a trail of blood invisible to the naked eye. The words pressed against me like a physical weight blood. A lot of it. They were now treating the case as a possible homicide. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The machines beeped steadily at Liam's side, each sound pulling me between hope and horror. My hand tightened around his as I realized the nightmare I had feared was unraveling into something far worse than I could have imagined. And I knew, before long, Liam would be the only one who could tell us what truly happened in that house. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines. Liam lay propped up on the hospital bed, his face pale, his fingers still clutched around that empty bottle as if letting it go meant losing the last piece of safety he had. I sat beside him, my hand wrapped around his, whispering that he didn't have to speak until he was ready. For a long time, I thought he never would. Then his lips trembled, and a thin voice broke through the silence. It came in fragments, halting, as though every word carried the weight of the storm he had hidden from. He spoke about the rain pounding against the windows that night, how he was building a tower with his blocks when the doorbell rang again and again. He remembered the way Daniel's face had changed, tight with worry, before he pressed him under the bed and pulled the blanket down low. I closed my eyes as he described the world he saw from that narrow gap the front door opening. His father's calm but firm voice, and then hers. Sabrina, his own mother. Liam's breathing quickened as he recalled her shouting, demanding money, insisting that Daniel had taken too much from her already. And then there was another man, taller, rougher. The boy's hands shook as he remembered the shove, the sound of his father stumbling, the sickening crack when his head struck the corner of the table. I could feel my heart tearing apart as he whispered the next part, the dragging noise across the floor. His mother's voice fading as they argued in the distance, and the door slamming shut. He had stayed hidden, frozen in fear, waiting for his father to rise. But the house had fallen into silence. When he finally stopped, the room felt unbearably still. The truth hung there between us. Too heavy to push aside, Sabrina had not only returned, she had been part of the night that shattered everything. I pulled Liam close, his tears soaking into my sleeve, my own body trembling with the weight of what he had carried alone. For a moment, I couldn't find words. All I could do was hold him tighter, knowing his testimony had opened a door none of us could ever close again. And deep inside, I felt the dread of what was still to come, the evidence that would either confirm or deny the nightmare he had just relived. The days that followed Liam's testimony felt like a blur of reports, updates, and restless nights. The detectives were piecing together fragments, each one confirming what my heart already feared. They showed me a grainy video from a neighbor's security camera. The storm that night had blurred much of the footage, but one detail stood out: a dark pickup truck idling outside Daniel's townhouse, and later pulling away with something long and heavy covered by a tarp. My stomach twisted as I realized what that could mean. Then came the visit from Mrs. Carlson, the elderly neighbor across the street. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had heard shouting and the crash of furniture that same night. Fear had kept her from calling the police. She wrung her hands as she spoke, her guilt almost palpable. I tried to comfort her, but her words only deepened the picture already forming in my mind. My son had been attacked in his own home, and people were too afraid to intervene. But the heaviest blow didn't come from the police or the neighbors. It came from my own memory. I suddenly recalled the day Daniel proudly handed me a folder. Years ago. Inside was a life insurance policy he had taken out when Liam was born. His smile was bright as he explained that no matter what happened, his family would be secure. At the time, it touched me deeply. I never questioned the wisdom of it. When the detectives pulled a copy of that same policy from his study, my breath caught in my chest. The sole beneficiary was Sabrina. Even after the divorce, even after her debts and reckless choices, Daniel had never changed the document. Out of loyalty, out of love, out of responsibility, he had left her name there. The officers explained quietly what that meant. If Daniel were declared dead, Sabrina would inherit enough money to clear her debts and more. What Daniel had seen as protection had become motive. What he intended as a gift had turned into a target painted on his back. I sat in silence, staring at the paper, the edges blurring through my tears. Anger and grief tangled inside me. My son's love had been twisted into a weapon against him, and the betrayal was almost too much to bear. And yet, deep down, I knew this was only leading to the moment I dreaded most, the confirmation of what had really happened to him. The call came just after dawn, when the world outside was still gray and hushed. A detective's voice on the line told me they had recovered a body and needed me to come in. My chest tightened so hard, it felt like my heart might split. The words blurred in my ears, but I understood enough. I knew where they were sending me: to the morgue. The ride there felt endless. Every red light stretched out like a punishment. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't prepare myself for what was waiting. When I finally arrived, the smell of disinfectant clung to the air, sharp and sterile. The hallways were lined with white tile, echoing every step, as if even the walls were hollow with grief. They led me into a room colder than any winter I had ever known. A metal table stood in the center, covered by a white sheet. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body refused to accept what my mind already feared. I told myself it could still be a mistake, that someone else was lying there. But then the sheet was drawn back, and all hope drained from me in an instant. It was Daniel, my boy. His face was pale, still, marked with bruises that told their own cruel story. His lips, once so quick to smile at Liam, were pressed into silence. My knees gave out, and I clutched the side of the table just to keep myself from collapsing completely. Memories came rushing in his first steps. The way he used to carry Liam on his shoulders. The sound of his laughter filling the kitchen. All of it crashed against me like a wave I couldn't withstand. I whispered his name, though I knew he couldn't hear me. The weight of finality settled into my bones. This was no longer a nightmare I might wake from. My son was gone. As they covered him again, I felt a hollow space open inside me, one that no justice could ever truly fill. But beneath the sorrow, a fire flickered. Sabrina had done this or helped make it happen. And now, it wasn't just grief I carried, it was resolve. Because what began in that morgue would not end there. It would follow us into the courtroom, where the truth would have to be laid bare. The courthouse felt like another world, one made of stone walls and heavy silence. I sat in the front row, my hands folded tightly in my lap, Liam's small fingers trembling inside mine. The air was tense. Every shuffle of paper and every creak of the wooden benches seemed louder than it should have been. When Sabrina was led in, her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, cold. I could not reconcile that woman with the young bride I once welcomed into my family. The trial unfolded like a slow, merciless clock. Piece by piece, the prosecutors rebuilt the night of Daniel's death. They spoke with calm authority, laying out facts like stones in a path I desperately wished not to walk. Photographs appeared, first Daniel's living room in disarray, blood patterns staining the carpet. The coffee table corner darkened with the mark that ended his life. I wanted to close my eyes, but I could not look away. Then came the video. Blurry, rain-slicked footage from a neighbor's security camera, a dark pickup idling outside Daniel's townhouse, headlights cutting through the storm. Minutes later, it pulled away with a tarp-covered shape in the bed of the truck. My breath caught, and I felt Liam stiffen beside me. That grainy image said more than any words could. The neighbor testified next. Her voice shook as she admitted she had heard shouting that stormy night and the crash of furniture. She had been too afraid to call the police. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her I understood fear, but my heart ached with the knowledge of what silence had cost. And then the most fragile voice of all filled the courtroom, Liam's testimony, recorded earlier so he wouldn't have to sit here again. His words were soft but unshakable, his father's last command to hide under the bed. His mother storming in with another man, the shove, the sickening crack, the sound of dragging. As the recording played, I closed my eyes and held Liam close, feeling the weight of his small body lean into mine. The prosecutor's final blow was the insurance policy. Daniel had taken it out years ago, an act of love meant to protect his family. But his failure to update it after the divorce left Sabrina as the sole beneficiary. That simple oversight, born of responsibility and love, had been twisted into motive for murder. My grief burned into anger. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat. Guilty. The word rang in my ears, steady and final. Sabrina was sentenced to life in prison, her accomplice to 20 years. Justice had spoken. But as I held Liam's hand and felt his tears soak into my sleeve, I knew there was no victory here, only survival. Daniel was gone, and nothing would ever make that right. All I could do was carry his memory and protect the boy he left behind. And as the gavel struck, echoing like thunder, I realized this was not the end. It was only the beginning of learning how to live with the truth. When the trial ended, when the cameras pulled back and the gavel's echo finally faded, I realized there was nothing left for us in Daniel's townhouse. The silence in those rooms was unbearable. Every corner carried the weight of his absence. I remember locking the door for the last time, the key cold in my hand, and feeling as though I was shutting away not just a house, but an entire chapter of our lives. I took Liam's hand and told myself we were going home, not to the life we had lost, but to the small town where I was raised, where the days passed quietly and neighbors still called each other by name. The first weeks were hard. Liam was fragile, like a shadow of himself, haunted by memories no child should ever carry. At night, he woke from nightmares, crying into his pillow until dawn. During the day, he barely spoke, clinging to me as if letting go would make him disappear too. I tried to be strong, but there were nights when I wept silently in the next room, asking God how we were supposed to keep moving forward. But I learned that healing comes in the smallest of steps. We started with routines simple, steady patterns he could rely on: breakfast at 8, a walk to the park in the morning, lunch at noon, bedtime prayers every evening. I made a chart for meals and water, letting him check off boxes with colored markers. It gave him a sense of control in a world that had spun out of his hands. Therapy helped too. A kind counselor introduced him to drawing as a way of speaking without words. At first, his papers were filled with storms, broken shapes, and dark colors. Over time, little by little, those drawings began to change. I remember the first time he sketched a house with the sun overhead and 2 stick figures holding hands. It wasn't much, but to me, it was everything it meant. He still believed in safety, in love, in a future. In my own quiet way, I healed alongside him. I cooked meals Daniel used to love, not to dwell in sorrow, but to keep his spirit close. I planted flowers in the garden, teaching Liam that life, even after the harshest winters, can bloom again. There were setbacks. Of course, days when Liam fell silent for hours. Days when grief knocked me down without warning. But we faced them together, reminding each other that we were not alone. The pain will never disappear completely. Losing a child leaves a scar that time cannot erase. But I have learned that love does not end at death. It carries forward in the laughter of a grandson, in the routines that build safety, in the determination to honor a memory by living fully. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it is this: hold the people you love closer than ever. Make the call. Share the meal. Sit for the bedtime story. Because we never know how many chances we have left. Liam and I are still walking our path of healing, one step at a time. And though the road is marked with loss, it is also lit with resilience. Love has carried us through the darkest storm, and it will continue to guide us toward the light. If this story touched you, I ask you to share it. Leave a comment about where you're listening from, or tell someone you care about how much they mean to you. Sometimes, the smallest act of love is what keeps us going. And in the end, love is all that truly lasts.